Welcome to Lecture 15 of BIB102 New Testament Survey. Today's lecture is going to be finishing up the book of Romans and then starting 1 Corinthians. So let's go ahead and get started. Picking back up where we left off in the last lecture, if you remember, we're on the major teachings in the book of Romans. We've already discussed how chapters 1 through 8 teach the fundamental doctrine of salvation, and then chapters 9 through 11 speak specifically about God's relationship with Israel. Now we're on letter C. Romans urges believers to enter into the full Christian life. Now, chapter 12 is completely devoted to what it means to live in the full Christian life. So let's look at some of those. Number one, the first thing we find out is that we should present our bodies as living sacrifices. This is a very famous, very commonly known passage in the book of Romans that Paul says he beseeches us by the mercies of God that we present our bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is our reasonable service. Now, as opposed to the dead sacrifices that they used to bring to be able to appease God, now the Lord wants us to be a living sacrifice with our lives. And this is said to be a reasonable service. Why? Because God, Jesus, was willing to die for us. We should be willing to live for him. Then number two, not only should we present our bodies as living sacrifices, secondly, we should think of ourselves rightly. Paul tells us here to not think more highly of ourselves than we ought to think. In other words, don't be prideful. This is asking us to be humble, having an air of humility in our lives. Now, humility is not thinking less of yourself. It is thinking of yourself less. Pride is putting yourself first and always thinking of you. Humility is thinking of others and how you can help them. Then number three, we should exercise our spiritual gifts. The purpose of a spiritual gift is to help other people. And every single believer has been given at least one spiritual gift, some more than one, but no one has all of them. And the reason why that is so we can all work together in harmony. Then number four, we should love other believers. And Paul says this love should be genuine. It should not be just love in words. It should be love in deeds. Then number five, we should have a right attitude concerning good and evil. In fact, Paul says that we should despise evil and cling to good, hold tight to good. Now, if we're supposed to hold tight to good, that despising evil must mean we should reject it, we should push it away, we should not have anything to do with it. Then number six, we should be joyful and patient. Now, sometimes the hardest thing to do is to be joyful in a bad situation or be patient when we're waiting for God to do something in our lives. Paul says the reason why we can be joyful in any situation is because we have hope. But hope is always deferred. Hope is in the future. So that means sometimes we need to just be patient and wait on God. Then number seven, we should be giving, unified, and honest. The giving here is that when we see another believer have a need, we should be willing to meet that need and to help them. Unified means we should all be working together for the same common goal, though that does not mean we will always agree about everything. It just means that when we disagree, we can still be friends. And then honest means we are always telling each other the truth and never trying to mislead or manipulate each other. And then lastly, number eight, we should be good to those who are not good to us. This might be the hardest one in the entire passage because Paul says to repay no one evil for evil, but to give good to all men. So you and I, our goal when we are wronged by someone else is not to figure out how we can hurt them back. It's to figure out how we can help them in the future. And then letter D. In chapter 13 of Romans admonishes believers to be subject to the government. Why should we be subject to the government? Number one is we should obey because God appoints our leaders. Paul begins this chapter by instructing his readers to obey the powers that are over them, the authorities that are over them because they have been appointed by God. Now, that may be a hard pill to swallow for some of us, but you have to understand the context of this passage. When Paul was writing this, in Rome, the person who's in charge of the government is a man by the name of Nero. He was one of the most ruthless and horrible leaders towards the Christians. If Paul, in this context, can write and say that we should obey them, even when he's being ruled by a very wicked leader, then especially should we apply this to today. Then number two, we should obey because we love our leaders. Interestingly, he mentions that we should do this because of the love we have towards each other. So because we have love towards each other, we should turn that love towards our leaders. Now, having the love for each other that we should, this should cause us to give respect to those whom respect is required. And then letter E, Romans encourages believers to mature in their faith and be unified together. The first thing he says about this in chapter 14 is Paul cautioned the immature believers from judging the mature and also the mature believers from looking down on the immature. Now, apparently there was a dispute going on in the Church of Rome over the lawfulness of eating meat that had been offered unto false idols. Now, no matter which way an individual landed on this, Paul's conclusion was that those who believed it was wrong to eat the meat were actually the weak brethren, and they were warned not to judge those who had no problem eating it. But those who did eat the meat were considered the mature brethren, but they were cautioned against looking down on those who thought it was wrong to eat the meat. Then number two, Paul warns everyone against offending other believers. Now, while Paul makes note that there was nothing wrong with eating the meat that he talked about in the previous one, he mentions that if it offends a believer, and that word offend there doesn't mean to hurt someone's feeling, that means literally to cause to stumble, to cause to sin. So if eating that meat caused a believer to think it was okay to worship that idol, then we should stay away from eating that meat. And he says, after all, no man is an island unto himself. No one's decisions only affect themselves. Everyone's decisions will affect others around them. And then thirdly and lastly, Paul instructs mature believers to support immature believers. So Paul follows this whole section up with his instructions for those who were, quote, strong in the faith. They are to bear the infirmities or immaturities of the weak. Now, this mentality is what actually motivated Paul to take the gospel to the Gentiles and to those who had never heard about God. This is, in fact, why Paul says he had not yet come to Rome to visit them. Now, the key to this issue, according to Paul, revolved around the unity that God desires for the church to have. If you and I can dwell together with disagreements, but looking towards a common goal and loving each other in spite of the disagreements, then we can support and help each other and fulfill the law of Christ. Now that we've finished looking at the book of Romans, we're going to look at the next book in the typical order of the New Testament, the book of 1 Corinthians. Per usual, let's start by looking at the introduction to the book of 1 Corinthians. Letter A, this book was written by Paul. And this is not disputed. It is stated very clearly in 1 Corinthians 1, verse 1. Then letter B, this book was written sometime between AD 54 and 55. In fact, some interesting things about this is that Paul visited this church on his second missionary journey, and Acts 18 tells us that he stayed there for 18 months. He then wrote this epistle while residing in Ephesus on his third missionary journey. Then letter C, this book was written to the Christians in Corinth. This one's kind of an easy one. This church, the church in Corinth, was composed of many newly converted Jews and Greeks, though it was predominantly a Gentile church. Now let's look at Roman numeral II, the purpose and importance of the book of 1 Corinthians. Letter A, The first reason why Paul wrote this was to clarify a previous letter that he had sent to them. Now, this is actually the second letter. So, what happened was he had written a first letter, sent it to them, but it needed some further explanation, so he wrote this one. So, even though this is called First Corinthians, it's actually the second letter. Now, where is the other letter? We do not have it. We have no record of it, and we will probably never discover it. But this one was kept preserved by the Lord for our edification. But not only was Paul's letter written to the Corinthians to clarify a previous letter, but it was also written to help resolve various problems that existed in the church. Some of the examples of various problems that this church had was bad attitudes toward the apostles. They had bad marital situations, incestuous relationships between step parents and stepchildren, and in even lawsuits between other Christians, which all of these will be discussed in the major teachings of the book of 1 Corinthians. And the third and final reason for writing the book of 1 Corinthians was to respond to a previous letter sent by the Corinthians. So basically, a timeline would have been Paul wrote a letter to them. They responded with many questions. So Paul decides to clarify what he wrote in his first letter with the first epistle to the Corinthians we have that we'll be studying today. So now let's get into the major teachings of the book of 1 Corinthians. Letter A. The first chapter rebukes divisions in the church. Rebukes divisions. The first thing that Paul points out is that he explains that they should seek to resolve their differences. Resolve their differences. Now, apparently there was a big division that he wants to address in this first chapter. The division that Paul rebuked was apparently over whom they associated themselves with. Some declared that they were with Paul. Some said that they were with Apollos. Others said that they were with Cephas, which is another name for Peter. And then still some said, oh no, we're with Christ. Paul's instruction to them is that they all speak the same thing, and that there be no division amongst them, but that they should be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. In other words, do not allow a person to divide you. Do not be associated with one individual that it causes you to have an argument with another. Not only does Paul explain that they should seek to resolve their differences, but number two, Paul admonishes them to exalt Christ alone. After all, Paul poses the question, is Christ divided? That's a rhetorical question. No, he's not. Then he asks another rhetorical question. Was Paul crucified for them? Or were they baptized in the name of Paul? Of course not. Paul even makes mention that he was thankful that he only baptized a small number of them so that there would not be even more of a division amongst those people. After rebuking the divisions in the church, letter B, 1 Corinthians warns of the coming judgment seat of Christ. Paul points out that all of our works, what we've done for Christ or what we've done for ourselves, will one day be made manifest. And he symbolizes it here with gold, silver, and precious stones. The things that we do for the Lord are like gold, silver, and precious stones. The things that we do for ourselves are like wood, hay, and stubble. And when fire is put to those elements, the gold, silver, and precious stone gets refined, while the wood, hay, and stubble burns up. Now, the fire here is Jesus revealing what we did, whether or not it was for him in reality, or if it was actually for ourselves. Some may not even receive a reward, but Paul says that they are still saved, yet so as by fire. And then the last point for this lecture is letter C. 1 Corinthians cautions against partiality and pride. Partiality is putting an individual above another individual. Paul cautions them against showing any type of partiality to an individual, even including an apostle. His argument is that even the apostles are made, quote, fools for Christ's sake. So why should they be shown preference? In fact, great humility is shown here on the part of Paul because he could have put himself on a pedestal above everyone else, but he actually said, do not put me on the same playing field as everyone else. And then he ends this chapter by cautioning them against being puffed up or prideful. Therefore, we should not view others or ourselves as better than anyone else, since we are all in Christ. That brings us to the end of Lecture 15. If you have any questions or you need anything, please do not hesitate to contact me.